Welcome to Evolution at Work Hardcore 2.0 coming your way. This is episode 139. Today, Mobster and I are going to get into how to utilize testosterone in a cycle by Pharmaqo. And in this episode, we're going to talk about why testosterone is so popular, how and why to use it solo and stacked, using it for your TRT, different Pharmaqo options. They have many different options, including we're going to get into some blends that they have. And we're going to talk about why Pharmaqo has grown in popularity. But first, let's talk about why testosterone is so popular. So, there was a poll done a few years ago, and they polled steroid users and they asked them, what is your favorite steroid to use? What is the steroid that you use most often? And number one was testosterone SIP, and number two was testosterone E. So SIP being cypionate, which is an ester, E versus enanthate. So even if you separate the esters and you don't even say testosterone, you just separate the esters, it still comes in at one and two. So it's the most popularly used steroid out there. So testosterone basically originally when they started developing these hormones and studying these hormones, they had to actually use the actual testosterone that was in our body as the hormone. But now they quickly figured out during that time to synthesize it. And now you're able to make testosterone in a lab by simply creating the sequences. Is really fascinating the way it's done. So from there, they took the testosterone molecule, they started playing around with it, and they started making additional steroids, testosterone derivatives. Then they took the dihydrotestosterone, the DHT, and they made DHT derivatives, and on and on and on. So they created different steroids that people use, including injectables and including orals. But in the end, a lot of people out there, they go back to the original, which is testosterone. And that's basically the standard that we look at when you're looking at ratios, for example, anabolic to androgenic ratios. You start with testosterone, which is 100 by 100. And then you can create other steroids from there when it comes to looking at on paper ratios. And you'll see some steroids are rated lower on the anabolic androgenic scale. Some are rated higher. Like Trend, for example, is 500 by 500. So on paper, it's 5 times more androgenic and 5 times more anabolic. Other steroids are less. Some steroids have zero androgenic effects on paper. But when you're comparing it, we always look at testosterone and say, well, testosterone is 100 by 100. Is in this steroid is 50 by 50. So that means it's half as much androgenic and half as much as anabolic, for example. So that's really the crux of it is we always go back to the testosterone. And people like to use testosterone. They like to use it solo. They like to use it stacked. And they like to use it as their TRT or HRT option. And that's what doctors in America prescribe. When you go to the doctor and you say, Doctor, my hormones are low, can you get my blood work done? He does their blood work and your testosterone levels are low, your hormones are low. Well, let's get you on testosterone replacement therapy. Let's get you on hormone replacement therapy. What's the number one most prescribed steroid? It's testosterone. They don't typically prescribe you other steroids because testosterone is cheap. Testosterone is widely available. It's legal with a prescription in the United States. And that's what doctors like to prescribe. And it works well for their patients. So overall, we see testosterone used by bodybuilders, by gym rats,
Yeah,
by everybody more than any other steroid out there. Mobster?
yeah. I was just thinking about the very basics of the science, Stephen. It occurred to me that perhaps, just as a sort of relative understanding for our listeners, testosterone no ester is probably the most like testosterone that's produced in your body. But of course, anybody that's used TNE realizes that it's very short half life. But of course, in reality, in the human body, you'd be producing more testosterone. So here's what's probably happened, and I'm just guessing here. We have done shows on the history of steroids, but we haven't specifically said, "Oh, this is how testosterone was developed." We know that men kind of, the scientists kind of understood the vitality, the essence of man, so to speak. And then we know, I think it was the late 1800s, the specific chemical, the specific compound called testosterone was identified. I believe it was the very late 1800s, early 1900s, and I'd want to double check the dates on this. That they actually isolated it in blood, and this is what it looks like, and started to get the molecular breakdown and so on and so forth. We know because we've done shows on the history, as I say, that there was very early forms, I think even extracts made from gerbils' testicles, amongst other things. They literally removed the testicles of animals to see the effect and then transplanted other testicles in and hold it stuff. It's just a load of fucked up shit. So obviously over time, what happens, historically speaking, again, is you've identified it, you've discovered it, you've isolated it, you've played around with extracts. Eventually, you start to realize that some people might have issues, medical conditions that are specifically affected or indirectly affected by a lack of or too much testosterone. And you create, as we know, various forms of testosterone. And the number one reason for that is, as we talked about before, some of the very early forms were literally either no ester or so quick acting that they only lasted in the body a few hours, Steve. So the scientists put their heads together, they played around with moving carbon atoms around and the molecule, and they realized that if we did this and we did that, we can make it last longer in the body. Steve and I have talked about certain particular medical conditions, for example, burns, and how catabolic they can be on the body in terms of muscle wastage and breakdown, as well as the damage to the actual burnt part of the tissue, and how you wanted a combination of esters, Steve, so that the patient started to feel the effects very, very quickly, within a few hours. And at the same time, you wasn't giving someone in pain, suffering from a burn, multiple injections per day. So you gave them a combination of esters, short, medium, and long acting, and therefore they could have something to affect immediately, and then something that was going to affect through the day, and then something that was going to have an effect over the week. And this, of course, works over time. Different medical conditions, different approaches. As bodybuilders, as athletes, we tend to look for, probably for the most part, Steve, and again, clicking onto Steve's list of the popularity, because we did a show specifically on the top 10 anabolic options, shall we call it. The great and vast majority of users, Steve, are looking to get more muscular. I would say that if in the general marketplace, when it comes to PED use, you're looking to get leaner. You want to look more muscular, not necessarily grow 20-inch arms or 50-plus-inch chest, but you do want toned muscles, you want tight muscles, you want a six-pack, you want vascularity. There are obviously some users a little bit more hardcore, looking to get bigger, grow, look like something they've seen on Instagram, looking like the best person on the beach, and then later on models, bodybuilders, strength athletes, and so on and so forth. And of course, multiple kinds of athletes, whether they're soccer players, American football players, you name it. We know, Steve, that performance enhancement, including pretty much every form of testosterone that's ever existed, from the very beginning, athletes have looked for an edge. And from the very beginning of anabolic steroids, and specifically the early forms of testosterone, athletes have experimented with right all the way back to the 1930s and beyond. The super soldier stuff with the Americans, the Russians, and the British, including methamphetamine, but also including some experiments with testosterone, as they're creating soldiers that could carry on fighting and kicking ass and stand awake for days, but also maintain a level of strength and so on. Right. So there's so much out there. So what you end up looking at is either specifically what works for you. There are certain options that Steve and I would prefer above others. And then obviously what's more specific for your actual requirement. Are you a strength athlete? Are you a soccer player? Do you play American football? Or are you a bodybuilder? And if you're a bodybuilder, we wouldn't recommend what a soccer player uses. And so this is the reasons why we ask specific questions on the forum. What's your aims? What's your level of body fat? What's your age? And so on. So for example, Steve, if we have someone come on the forums and they've got low levels of testosterone in the blood test, perhaps the first thing we would recommend is some sort of TRT. We're going to talk about that. So there would be a longer acting ester in there. In other times, we would talk about making sure that the dosage is correct. Most users don't need professional levels of testosterone in all its forms, and other steroids for that matter too. So all of these things, I think the popularity, Steve, basically comes down to, and I think this in terms of actual physiological response as well as what people think, which is not always necessarily the same thing, but you're talking about the male hormone testosterone. And so you identify straight away with, well, therefore, I would want something like that's what my body produces, but I want more than my body produces because I'm looking to get a specific response. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing, arguably, Steve, and you and I have had debates as to popularity and our own personal choices, is for the most part, testosterone works. Why would people prefer testosterone over, say, for example, sustanon or nandrolone or whatever if it didn't work? So the argument then becomes, you and I have talked about D-bol, and we said it's kind of idiot proof. You know, you take 30 to 50 milligrams a day, most people blow the fuck up. And that's what they're using it for. It's a bulker, it's a strength thing, it's a great pump. This is the so why wouldn't people buy a performance enhancing drug, specifically in this example, testosterone, if it didn't work? I
Yeah.
think that's got to be the number one argument. 80 or 90% of users get some positive anabolic response to using testosterone. So that explains the popularity. The other thing which you and I've touched on is it's one of those, if it's not broken, you don't need to fix it. And the price is very, very reasonable. I've got to be honest, Steve, as we talked about before, in modern terms, per milligram, per vial, you're paying the least amount now, listeners, than you've ever had throughout history, even if the price has been the same for the last 10 years. Everything else has gone up, but your testosterone's the same goddamn price it was 10 years ago. You're doing incredibly well, listeners. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons testosterone is so popular is you can get a vial for less than it costs you to get a good car wash done on your car. So it's very affordable where anyone can get it, and a vial will last you a long time depending on how much you use. So really, there's a lot of different good things about what testosterone can do for you. It can help you gain mass, it can help you gain strength, it can help you improve your libido and improve your mood. So there's a lot of good things in the body. Um, Testosterone, a little bit of the history, they didn't really start using testosterone until the late 80s and the 90s. And this was in coincided with the revelation of anti-estrogen drugs. They started using Nolvadex, and Nolvadex allowed them to be able to control estrogen. Because the thing with testosterone, when you're using it at a greater than TRT level, it's going to aromatize in the body into estrogen. And when you're using it at too high of a dose, which would be higher than a TRT dose, you're going to get a greater amount of estrogen aromatizing in the body where your body's not going to be able to get rid of it in time. So it's going to build and build and build. So you run the risk of estrogenic side effects, bloating, water retention, which has a domino effect and causes high blood pressure and things like insomnia. And then, of course, there's the risk of gynecomastia, which is the bitch tit. So, luckily, Pharmaqo not only provides excellent testosterone, and we're going to go over the options, but they also provide many of the options to help with estrogen issues, including aromasin, arimidex, and letro, which are drugs that they did not have access to in the late 80s and early 90s. These drugs, aromasin, and Arimidex and Letro, they didn't even know that these drugs even existed. So these drugs kind of came in the bodybuilding scene, mobster, more toward the late 90s, early 2000s. And then you had Novadex. They started using Novadex in the late 80s. Some of the guys who were really in the know. But Novadex really is more of a thing to use in the PCT. But some people, when they get in a situation where they have estrogen issues and it's a dire situation, they'll stack Nolvadex and Letro. But my point is, Pharmaqo has you covered, so it's safe to jack up the dose of testosterone. I recommend aromasin as a number one option that will
Yeah.
control your estrogen issues for the most part. Now, some people maybe 5 or 10% of you may be extremely estrogen prone, where you don't want to run a lot of testosterone, because no matter what you do, you end up getting itchy nipples. Like, right, I have clients, even if they only run like 150 milligrams a week of testosterone, they'll start getting itchy nipples and start having side effects, and they'll start freaking out. So, you got to be aware of that. And for some of you, testosterone may not be a good option, but for most of you, you'll get a lot of good benefits of testosterone. Mobster?
Yeah, more of an expansion, Steve, on the historical side in terms of availability, just because I think you and I sounded like we were contradicting each other, but we wasn't. Because historically, and I've mentioned this already, we know that there were some very early forms. I think methyl test was one of the ones that springs to mind that you and I found an advert for, and it was used actually in the image that we put on with regard to this podcast that we've done on it. And it was from I think it was from a Popular Science magazine advert for an early form of testosterone in the form of methyl test. The problem was, as become later on, and where Steve said 1980 is also accurate, is because it was about availability. You and I talked. Steve just said about the AIs, and dealing with the side effects of using steroids, and availability of products like that wasn't really a thing per se until 1980. This is quite correct. So when we've done shows on the golden age of bodybuilding, we've touched upon the simple fact of the availability of forms of testosterone and all the different esters was negligible. We said that there was very little. For example, I think we discussed the primobolan, but there wasn't really that many forms of testosterone per se available. There might have been one or two that had access. I've talked about, I think, Steve, with you, that Arnold did a TV show. You can find this clip on YouTube where he's being interviewed, saying how bad testosterone is. An interviewer, Barbara Walters, as one, did the same thing with Arnold, where they literally come right out and say to him, have you used testosterone? He goes very calmly, cocksure, as Arnold was back in the day, says, oh, yes. And I think in the Barbara Walters interview, he talks about, and we mentioned this in the historical show, going to a doctor in California that was recommended to the guys or the would-be Olympians, getting what was available at that time. And as I've said on other shows, Steve, what they had then, including, as Steve says, the AIs, is like a tenth of what we have available now. You never mind blends, just singular esters. We were discussing in the pre-show one product. I'm not going to be specific, Steve, but one product that has 5 different esters in. 5. So Arnold and the gang, up to, as you say, 1980, Steve, did not have access to products like that. They just didn't. I can think of some great stories from that time. I think Pete Graminsky, one of the owners of Gold's Gym, talking about some obscene levels of steroids that he was taking, legendary stuff. I've just seen a video the other day with him on it. And he was talking about something ridiculous that I've mentioned online before, 10,000 milligrams a week, because his uncle worked at a pharmaceutical company. But what was available was a very, very, very limited shopping list with no AIs or negligible amounts of product. Only the rare handful of people had access to a wide range of products. And even in the 90s, Steve, until we started to see the growth of underground labs and approved sources like we have now, how many times have you and I discussed people using what their dealer had, what the man with the bag in the trunk of the car of the gym car park had available, what had been able to be smuggled out of a lab, what had been available to be smuggled over the border? You just didn't have the choices that you have now. So looking back at that time, it wasn't really, there wasn't so much that these things hadn't been invented. I think the part of the historical show that you and I refer to, that there is an actual list of over 100, I believe it's 121, I think it's on Wikipedia, of all of the patented forms of testosterone derivatives. 121. The problem, of course, was many of these were identical to one that had been invented before, had no greater or lesser effect, just didn't work. Or why would you want 121 choices when a dozen work and do the job? And a lot of those come down to, as we talked about, specific medical conditions. And some of them might have required more opinion than others, so they just dropped off and didn't get used. This is where some of the pro-hormone stuff come from as well, where things were steroid-like but wasn't steroids and so on. So it gets a bit confusing. In terms of the whole ester thing, Steve, just to clarify this last point before we move on, essentially half-life, guys. Steve talks about clearance times being roughly, is it 5 times the length of the half-life or whatever, Steve? But for the most part, it's how long or how effective, should we say, a steroid is effective or useful in your body. So again, the shortest version, and this is just me doing off the top of my head, I'm happy for Steve to contradict me. Test no ester would be the shortest, briefest, in and out of your system very quickly. I
Yeah,
think it's like,
we're gonna
yeah,
go over all of them. Yeah, test
yeah.
based.
And then the really, really long esters can be weeks and weeks and weeks, as we talked about. But
Yeah,
we go into this properly. We're going to talk about this properly in a moment. Back to you, Steve.
yeah. Let's talk about how and why to use testosterone solo. So look, at the end of the day, I've talked about this on prior shows, but it needs to be said. If you're gonna use testosterone in a cycle and run it solo, using 100 or even 200 milligrams, I don't see the point because you're gonna be shutting yourself down when you use testosterone. That's very, very important to understand that. A lot of people don't understand that. They think, well, if I just inject testosterone, it's gonna add to what my broad body already produces, and that's just not how it works. Okay, the way it works is when you introduce exogenous hormones into your system, your body's pituitary glands will stop producing hormones entirely. And you can get blood work done to see that. Your LH and your FSH will tank to zero, meaning your pituitary glands are not producing hormones. So the idea here is you're shutting yourself down to give yourself more exogenous hormones that are synthetic, that are coming into the body. And so it makes more sense if you're going to run testosterone solo to do 300 to 500 milligrams a week or more. But 500 milligrams a week is the number one most popular amount. And I highly recommend, especially if you go that high or even at 300 milligrams, to use an AI. Now, the question everyone asks is how much? How much do I need of an AI? How much aromasin do I need? How much aromanex do I need? Everybody's going to be a little different, but what you have to do is you have to gain experience to see what dosage ratio works. And another tricky thing is your body will change over time. So you may need a lot more AI now, or you might need less AI now, and then in the future that may change. So blood work on cycle is a great way to help manage what your estrogen is, but you want to keep your estrogen balanced. You don't want to have it too low and you don't want to have it too high. So that's a really great way to kind of approach it. Mobster, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, listeners. I mean, I don't know that there's necessarily anything extra to add to that. We do recommend blood tests. We do like to. I mean, this is an example, Steve, when it comes to people's responses. We talk about previous PED use or history, if you like, guys. So, for example, there's an argument to be made in a small way, Steve, that prior use arguably might lower sensitivity. There's a tendency sometimes, and I have to be clear on this particular one. I'm going to sound a tiny bit preachy, guys. There's a tendency sometimes towards using more than you did previously just because, versus knowing that you need to do that by the blood test or whatever, Steve. As an example, and this is probably slightly less common. If you used testosterone in the past and you had a great response, say, for example, 500 milligrams a week solo, or even as part of a stack, we'll talk about as well, but you haven't used PEDs, including testosterone, for a number of years, then I always say do what you did before. If it worked before and you haven't used any performance enhancement steroids, etc., but specifically steroids in this example, for a number of years, your response is going to be very, very good. There's an argument to be made for a small increase if, for example, I ran testosterone last year at 500 milligrams, then in order to get close to, arguably, it's never going to be quite as good as it was before, but in order to get close to the results that got previously, I might need to increase. The problem becomes, I think, sometimes, Steve, and I can see why. I've never been one for trying every steroid there is just because. I am aware through some of my historical use of certain products that work incredibly well for me versus others do not. But I've also tried to, and Steve and I have talked about this on multiple shows, to hold back from the idea that I need to go from 500 milligrams to a gram, from a gram to 1.5 grams to 2 grams, and so on and so forth. For the most part, and we'll discuss this when we talk about dosing and cycling, there is a kind of sweet spot. There is the typical response that most listeners will have, and so on and so forth. There will
Yeah.
always be outliers. So you need to be kind of clear on this, guys. You might not be an outlier. You do not need to double up just because. So when we're going to give you some suggestions on dosaging and so on and so forth, keep that in mind. Also, your frequency of using. If you're running multiple short cycles per year, your response will differ for someone that only runs one cycle per year, and so on. So you need to have all these kind of sort of things in your mind. Again, this is why we get you to come on the forums and why we ask these questions. Back to you, Steve.
Length of using testosterone solo. Now, if you're using a shorter ester, you can go 6 to 10 weeks, no problems. Using a longer ester, it's going to take longer to reach peak in your system. So you might want to aim for up to 14 weeks. You don't want to run any hormones too longer, or your body may not able to bounce back properly. So cycling testosterone solo, just keep in mind you're going to open yourself up to both, depending on what dose you use. The higher dose you use, the more you're going to open yourself up for androgenic effects, for estrogenic effects, and that can definitely cause side effects. So be aware of that. A lot of people are on misconception. Oh, if I use testosterone solo, it's a safe stack. No, it's not a safe stack. I wouldn't categorize it as a safe stack. It's just as risky of using any other steroid. You're gonna get shut down. You're gonna have both estrogenic and androgenic side effects. So if anything, it's more risky than a lot of these other steroids. If you ran Primo, for example, by itself for 500 milligrams a week, you don't got to worry about estrogenic or androgenic side effects. You're going to get a lot less results because of that. But that's just the truth. So a lot of people are in the misconception, well, I'm going to use testosterone as my first cycle. It's a safe cycle. And a lot of people recommend to go and use testosterone solo 500 milligrams a week. Oh, that's a great first cycle for you. It's a safe cycle for you. It's not. These are very serious hormones. Your body naturally produces anywhere from 80 to 100 milligrams a week of testosterone. And now you're running 5 or 6 times that dose. So, that's how it is. I mean, it's going to cause issues. It's going to cause your blood to thicken up. It's going to cause your blood pressure to rise. It's going to cause your cholesterol levels to be off. So don't think, well, this is a safe stack. It's not, but you must use it properly and you must cycle it. And you can cycle steroids for the long term. I've been cycling steroids for how long now, Mobster? Maybe what, 16, 17, 18 years now?
Yeah,
And
I'm just trying to.
my
In my
health
case, what
is,
is it, 20, 23 years for me now, Steve? 37 till
yeah.
now? Yeah,
And you're a
23
lot
years.
bigger guy than me,
Yeah,
but I stay in shape. I donate blood twice
yep,
a year. I donate plasma, which is red cells, which is takes the longest to when you go to a donation center, takes the longest for them to extract because it really does a great job of lowering your hematocrit and
mm,
thinning out your blood. So this is very important things to be do, monitoring your blood work and all this stuff. So you can absolutely cycle steroids safely long term. You just got
yeah,
to do it the right way, and you got to
yeah.
be
I'm just going
aware.
to say that, Steve. You and I, and I'll be a little bit unkind to the both of us. We're kind of boring. We don't abuse. We don't run crazy cycles. We don't do multiple, like 3 or more cycles per year. I think the most I've done in the past was 2. Typically, I would do 1. All my cycles, bar I think the first 1 or 2 goes a cycle, and they were just debol, Steve, were around my competitions. It's only in recent years with TRT, and that's a very recent thing for me. What are we looking at now, Steve? 5, 6 months. But Steve and I mentioned on a show that we record just this week how Steve is probably going to wait for a few more years before he looks at TRT. I've literally started TRT a couple of weeks before my 60th birthday. So we are very boring in that our stacks, the way that we use them, are not sexy. But we have been 16 plus years, in Steve's case, 23 plus years, in my case. And touch wood, as we record this show, neither one of us have any serious side effects. Steve is, as you say, blood testing, blood donating, And obviously, we try as best we can, Steve. I would say we're pretty accurate in that regards. The advice that we give you guys is the advice that we take
Yeah.
ourselves. We
So
have maybe, yeah,
I
go on.
actually got my blood work done, I think maybe 4 or 5 months ago. Through and I actually work with a doctor. She's really good, and she's a very important part of my team. And she said, Steve, your hematocrit is rising. She's like, you're very healthy. You're like my healthiest patient I've seen, but your hematocrit's a little high. And I said, she's like, are you using hormones? And I said, yes, yes. She's like, are you using hormones again? I'm like, yes, I just came off a cycle. She's like, I'm going to write you a prescription to go have them take out a pint of blood out of you. So I said, no, it's okay. I'm going to go donate. I haven't donated in about 7 months or 8 months. And I usually do donate every 6 months because they only let you do every 6 months if you're donating the plasma. If you do regular blood donation, I think it's every 3 or 4 months. I think every 4 months. So anyway, I went and got the blood donation done. Then I went back, got blood work done again, and my hematocrit was back where it should be. So that's a perfect example of not keeping your head in the sand and taking things serious. So let's move on to how and why to use testosterone stacked. So one of the reasons why you want to use testosterone stacked is the versatility. And one of the things that I like to do, and a lot of people like to do, Mobster, is they'll like to use the testosterone to give the cycle a little bit of a kick. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're using Primo or Equipoise or any of these mild steroids that don't have very much androgenic activity, don't have very much estrogenic activity or no estrogenic activity. Then you throw in a little testosterone, and that will give things a little bit of a kick. That will help you build more muscle, add more weight, increase appetite, get more aggression, little things like that add up. So what I like to do is I'll say, you know what, run 500 milligrams of Primo, run 500 milligrams of Equipoise, which are both excellent products that Pharmaqo sells, by the way. And then you could add the Pharmaqo testosterone just a little bit, 150 milligrams or 200 milligrams or 250 milligrams. That's a great option. Same thing with DECA, which Pharmaqo has as well, or MPP, or any other steroid that they sell. You can add any of those injectables with the testosterone. Not only that, but you can mix it with the testosterone, and it mixes really well with testosterone because it will decrease the post-injection pain. Trenbolone, for example, causes tren cough in some instances. And the way that I tell people, a little trick when it comes to tren cough, is mix in a little testosterone with the tren in the syringe and then inject it. By doing this, you're diluting the tren, so you're lessening the chances of getting tren cough. And if you do get the tren cough, it's going to be less extreme because now you're injecting a mix of tren and test at the same time, you see. So that's a little trick you can do. So there's so many different ways that you can use testosterone. Orals. I know you like to do this, Mobster. Oral steroids, Anavar, Turinabol, those are they're not very androgenic steroids. They don't cause a lot of aggression. They don't cause necessarily a lot of strength increases. But when you stack it with testosterone, it makes them doubly and triply more effective.
I'm a
So
big oral. I'm a big oral fan, Steve, but I very rarely stack orals with an injectable cycle. Very rare. I might actually be doing it this cycle, but very rare. But I'm a big fan of orals. I think part of this stuff, and this is an interesting point to be made, Steve, and I'll bring you back in a second, is I was thinking about a response to, and this is part of the reason why people stack products. And I was thinking thus, the better condition you start a cycle in, i.e., the leaner you are, the more muscular you are, by design, meaning that you've put the effort in to become that way, as well as if you are blessed genetically, the better response you'll get. So the more likely you are to see, especially when we're talking about stacking, Steve, responses to additions to a stack. One of the things, Steve, when we talked about this on other shows, is, and this is the reason why you might stack something at the beginning and not at the end of a cycle, or you might use an oral, is that a lot of people like testosterone in stacks simply because of how they feel when they're using testosterone. Literally, the idea, I think it's like swapping between a normal car to a souped up car or having the same car with a souped up engine. The idea that you're on stack you're on cycle, you've got these products in, and you're using testosterone to boost the cycle, so to speak, or to get some effect at the beginning, so that you feel like you are on cycle, you feel like everything's been turned up to 11, and you're able to do the things that you intended to do with your training, with your nutrition when you're on cycle. So, yeah, back to you, Steve.
Yeah, and so the example you would do if you were to stack an oral with it is you can use the orals to start your cycle. You could do a 12-week testosterone cycle, for example, and then you can use an oral to kickstart, and then you can use an oral to finish. So you do the first 4 or 5 weeks with an oral to kickstart, and then you finish the cycle. You take a break from the orals in the middle of the cycle, and then you can use an oral to finish it. That's a popular way to use testosterone. So I'll give you a couple examples. Let's say you wanted to start the cycle with a bulk and then finish it with a cut. So you say you do anywhere from 300 to 500 milligrams of the Pharmaqo testosterone for 12 weeks. That's going to be run concurrently. And then you kickstart the first 4 weeks with some Dianabol. Say 20 to 30 milligrams a day of the Dianabol. And then, because Pharmaqo has excellent Dianabol, and then you can finish the cycle with Pharmaqo Proviron or Pharmaqo Winstrol or any of those. So with Proviron, 25 to 50 milligrams is good, or you could finish it with some Winstrol, 25 to 50 milligrams is good. So you're using those fast acting orals and you're throwing them in there to give you a little boost to start. And you could do Anavar to kickstart. You could do Anavar in the middle of the cycle. There's all kinds of ways that people like to do, or you can just wait till you to the end of your cycle and throw in the Winstrol or the Anavar. So there's
Steve, what
many
about,
different ways.
and I've said this on other shows just to finish this particular topic as well, from my view, competition stacks versus the average Joe. So, and again, this refers, as I said a few minutes ago, to the condition a person's in. So typically a competition stack would have you slightly out of condition to begin with, and you will see longer esters, and you're less likely to see, say, for example, in that example, Steve, a Kickstarter. But what you might do is, and let me give you a competition stack again, you're looking towards the 16, sometimes 20, 21 weeks. That 21 weeks seems to be the best long-term option for those competing getting into shape. So for example, slower, longer acting esters at the beginning, Steve, you can break this down into 3 parts. The person starts to get into condition, not stage ready. So you will start to see the shorter esters, medium acting. You might see some blends there in the middle. You might see manipulation of what's going on. And then the much, much shorter esters at the end. What you also see with athletes, and I'm talking about specifically athletics and other athletes, is that they tend to use shorter acting products again to peak for competition, to have a certain level of athleticism or peak strength on the day. And again, also some athletes, of course, are tested. So the longer acting esters will have left their system. Again, referring to Pharmaqo, Steve, and looking at the availability of products, you could just with the forms of testosterone, and if you did nothing else, Steve, you could have a longer acting, a medium acting, and a shorter acting, and that's if you did nothing else on a cycle. Let's talk about, as you say, the stacks and dosing and so on and so forth for the typical user, someone looking to get muscular, someone looking to get a little bit stronger in the gym, and perhaps ready for the beach or whatever.
Yeah, I basically, yeah. So if you wanted to get really lean, what I would do in that situation, Mobster, is I would run the testosterone lower. And it sounds very cliched, but most of you are gonna do much better with lower testosterone if you're cutting because higher testosterone is more water retention and you get a boost in appetite. So running testosterone, let's say at 200 milligrams a week or 150 milligrams a week, and then you could stack in if you wanted to go the oral route, some Winstrol, or you could stack in even Masteron. And Pharmaqo has great Masteron as well. So you could go high on the Masteron, 400 or 500 milligrams, or you could add in Tren as well at 250 milligrams. So that'd be a good recomposition cycle for sure. Give me a bulking cycle that you would use with testosterone, Master, before we move on to TRT.
I mean, listen, all your regular listeners, our regular listeners, Steve, know what my favorite bulking cycle is. Sustanon at 250 milligrams milliliter. And I'm looking at the Pharmaqo product right here, right now. And of course, my other favorite for that combination is Deca, Nandrolone Decanate. And again, basically, roughly the same ratios. I dose typically every 4 days. And at the minute, Steve, the products that I'm using right now, it works out to, with Provaron included, to boost the free testosterone from slightly over a gram per week, 1,050 milligrams. I'm going to run that particular stack right now for some strength stuff that I'm doing to get as big a fuck as possible. I'm going to run that whole cycle. It's going to be 8 weeks. The testosterone is, of course, a combination of testosterones, different esters. And one of the things, and I forgot this years ago, and I kind of had to remind myself, and annoyingly, Steve had actually mentioned this on shows, but it hadn't registered my feeble brain. And I think I run my last bulking cycle or the one before, and the last time I used it or the one before when I used Sustanon and Deca, and I've forgotten just how long specifically the Sustanon is in your system, and couldn't quite work out why my bench hadn't gone down, even though I'd finished using the products 2 weeks prior. That was, of course, because they were still in my system. So that's a great advantage for me. I'm not a tested athlete. I don't have to get blood tests for any particular reason unless I want to. So how long it's in my system, what I was using it for, etc. Again, guys, make sure you're aware that if you want to get in condition, you might want to take a different approach. I was looking to get as big as a fucking. Honestly, Steve, I would like to get, if only temporarily, as big as 340 pounds on this particular go through. So the last time I hit, which was 4 weeks following a cut stack, I went from 327 to 336 pounds, which was my all-time heaviest. So for me, absolutely a bulker, absolutely blown the fuck up. That's one of my favorite ones, Steve. I know, and I've talked about this before. Let's just give you an example, guys, of testosterone enanthate with combination with other products that my buddies used to use back in the day, and they loved it. And that were between 300 and 500 milligrams a week in combination with whatever else they were using. And again, for most of my buddies, we all kind of stuck to roughly 8 to 12 weeks maximum. Again, that's because they were competing slightly more frequently than I was, 3 or 4 times a year versus 1 to 2 times. And they were specifically looking to be as strong as they possibly could on the day of a novice or intermediate strongman competition. Does testosterone get used by strength athletes at the highest level? Absolutely. I suspect there's some short versions of tren in there, but again, the bigger guys don't do well with tren because it's just really hard on the side effects. The bigger you are, especially the more out of shape you are, but it's a great strength enhancement. So yeah, what about? I mean, look, cutting stuff. I'm looking at, for example, Steve. They got the EQ test, 500 milligram per milliliter. The EQ test, I believe, there's a 300 milligrams derivative, and then you've got other combinations. We've also looked at Tri-Test and the multi-ester products. Guys, for me, for example, in the EQ one, Steve, how would you do that? Would that be a cutter? They don't do a
Yeah.
testosterone.
Equipoise,
Yeah,
you do a lot of different things for sure, buddy. But let's
yeah,
move on to TRT. I think we've covered a lot of the stacks. Let me go over TRT and then we'll move on to the different pharmacal options. Look, TRT stands for testosterone replacement therapy and has rapidly become popular with more and more clinics popping up and it's becoming mainstream in medicine. Ironically, it has become way too easy in America to get TRT to the point where even 25-year-olds are getting on it who don't even really need it.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
wasn't the case 15, 20 years ago. It was hard for people to get a prescription. Now it's way too easy. It's like the opposite. So, we can debate the pros and cons of that for another day. But look, the purpose of the TRT is to replace what your body should produce. It's usually a good option for those who get older and you're tired of having the test levels of an 80-year-old man. So that's really the crux of why TRT should happen. A common dose of TRT can be from 80 to 125 milligrams a week. Now, some clinics are overdosing people, and again, that's a debate for another day. But overdosing on TRT is not a good idea because, as I said earlier, let's say your hematocrit starts going up, your cholesterol starts getting out of whack, your blood pressure starts going up, you end up getting a stroke from having too high TRT levels. So it's important to be aware of that and run TRT properly. A lot of people are doing self TRT. It saves you money and you avoid having to waste time going to doctors. So you can get your
Yeah.
own blood work done and get your own Pharmaqo testosterone
Yes, absolutely.
and do TRT. So let's go over the Pharmaqo options because there's so many of them. And I talked about at the beginning of the show, the top two most popular options was Test Sip and Test E. So Pharmaqo has a 200 milligram a milliliter Test Sip, and they have a 300 milligram a milliliter Test E. So with Test Sip, this is the most commonly used option, especially for those of you who like the versatility of only having to inject once a week or even once every 2 weeks or once every 10 days. Now, some people like to inject it twice a week. That's fine too. With the Test E, it's similar to Cypionate, but it's got a slightly shorter half life and it's very popular. It's very smooth to inject. Post injection pain is pretty unheard of with it unless you're extremely sensitive. And you're going to want to inject Test E once or twice a week. So these are great options for cycles. Test Prop is the next one, 100 milligrams a milliliter. This is a shorter ester. A lot of people who compete like to use Test Prop because they'll stop using it close to their competition, and then it'll trickle out of their system a lot quicker than SIP or E would. So that gives them more flexibility in terms of that. You're going to have to inject Test Probe once every 1 to 3 days. So this is a good option too if you want to run a short ester, a short cycle. 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 week cycle, or even 9 or 10 weeks, because it's going to be in your system peaking at a quicker time, and it's going to be out of your system in a quicker time so you can start the recovery process. So this is a great option for those of you who want to cycle and also keep your fertility and keep your reproductive system looking good. Monster, why don't you go over Sustanon? I know that's your favorite. What
Yeah,
does Pharmaqo have?
Sustanon 250 milligrams a milliliter, as Steve said, absolutely my favorite. The 250 milligrams is probably an industry standard now, Steve, but we can talk about the specific qualities of Pharmaqo shortly. Yeah, super, super popular. I believe one of the comments that Steve's made in the past, but I will agree with this, that again, in combination with Decker Steve, that men of my generation, the older gym users, these combinations seem to be incredibly popular with them. You also see it, as I already said, and we mentioned earlier in the show, as a classic bulker, something to blow you the fuck up. Probably right up there, Steve. In fact, I'd actually argue slightly better for me specifically than a straightforward Dynabol cycle for bulking up. So yeah, that's absolutely. There's other products here, Steve. You've got a test AQ, 50 milligrams, a test base, which we touched upon earlier in the show,
Yeah,
Steve,
that's what
50
it is.
milligrams.
The test AQ50 is the test base.
Okay,
But
yeah, it's just there was a comma
yeah.
on the show notes. So listen, guys, testosterone based. I touched upon this when I said there are certain tested athletes. I'm thinking specifically, for example, Steve, athletes who do athletics, but also fighters. If you're going to be tested, and again, this is one of those peak combinations. You get super fit, super strong, um, and you want to be slightly more aggressive just with a small increment to your normal testosterone levels, assuming you're not already running other products temporarily for a fight or for an event. And then it's quicker, it's literally the shortest acting of anything.
Well, it's not even
Yeah,
an
so sorry,
act.
CNE is the shortest, test base is the next shortest, I believe. Is that correct?
Say again?
Testosterone, no ester, followed by test base. Is that correct in
Well,
terms of the short?
it's the same thing. Yeah, test base.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has
Sorry,
no
just the
ester.
way
Yeah.
it's written. That's the
Yeah,
way. So,
so
so test
yeah, so
no
then
ester means it's in and out of your system within
well,
hours.
it's not that there's no ester added, it's that that's the natural exo
Yes, yes.
that's the testosterone that is coming, and then they'll add an ester on these other ones. That's what they do. They add an ester to have a slow release. So with the test base, it's boom, in and out of your system quick. So you literally
Yeah.
can't even be tested for it, and they can't find it because it's in and out of your system literally the
Now,
same
let me
thing.
give you an example there, guys. Let's say that I was going to use this for an event. I wouldn't, but let's say that I could take this in the morning, do the competition at lunchtime, and if I time it right, Steve, and I avoid the testers for a few hours, they could come and grab hold of me at 4 o'clock, and there would be nothing to show on the radar, so to speak. If they got me at lunchtime, they might be able to see something on their test. But if they got me a few hours after the event, and certainly multiple hours after taking it ready for the event, I'd almost certainly avoid that. It's
Yeah.
probably the only way you can do that now.
It's
Talk about
also
Steve the blends because this,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say it's also good if you just want to take something pre-workout, and then it gives you a nice spike during your workout. But overall,
yeah.
it's not something very popular. So I would stick to the
Not in the
esters.
normal
Yeah.
cycle as such, Steve. Not for most of our listeners. It's something that's available. It's a weapon in your arsenal. But most of our listeners, as I said at the beginning of the show, are going to be looking for muscular gains, getting into the shape of the beach, looking a bit more hench than they did before, feeling perhaps more vital or sexual, and testosterone base or testosterone arrestor, etc., isn't really going to fit what they want. I tell you what, this is getting to the blends a little bit here, Steve, specifically for the following reasons. And we've talked about this when we talked about approved sources, including Pharmaqo before. Right? Why do blends exist? Simplicity. Simplicity, Steve. Your labs like Pharmaqo have looked at what you do, what cycles are popular. We already know that sip and enanthate was number one and number two. So you go, okay, what is the most popular cycle a person can do? What are most of our cycle listeners, customers, sorry, in terms of Pharmaqo, what's their aim of their cycle? Can we produce a product that closely matches a combination that they would make if they only had single source products? And this is what ends up happening. So, for example, Steve, I'm looking at the EQ test 500 milligram. They do a 300 milligram version as well, I believe. I'm looking at this, but the EQ test 500, higher doses than there used to be in the past, but of course, products have got a lot better. So, the post injection pain that was previously was practically non existent. I think I've seen one complaint yesterday, and that's the first complaint I've seen about a high dose testosterone product in 2 years. So, that's number one. Number two is, again, as we said earlier on, what would you use this cycle for? Again, test and EQ together would be great, getting you lean and muscular. So why not produce a product that has these two things in combination? So that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, another one here, Stephen, I'll bring you back in a second, try-test, which is testcipionate, testinamphate, and as a testecanate. And so the idea, again, is why would you use this? And what did I say about the yeses earlier on of having something that's quickly working in your system, something that's medium, and something longer? This is actually slightly longer. If it had the TNE or test base, you would have super quick, but it's actually medium long acting. It means you can pin less frequently. That's another reason for blends. You don't have to look as an example, guys. We've seen stacks where guys are pinning multiple times per day, never mind per week.
Mm-hmm.
And the most users want to pin less frequently,
I
less often.
I would use this one. Like, let's say you're doing a long cycle or you're doing TRT. This would be great for that because that testosterone decanate has a super long ester where it's in your
Yep,
system 8, 9 weeks after you stop.
yep, yep.
So you definitely don't want to use this if you're doing like a short cycle. So it'd be great for TRT because you can 1 cc is 400 milligrams. So you could do like half a cc every 2 weeks, and that would give you 200 milligrams every 2 weeks. So it's 100 milligrams a week average. That'd be great for TRT. And you can, it'd be really nice to not have to pin large amounts too often.
What about
This,
another option, Steve? And I actually suggested this the last couple of days. And this is if you are going to use this particular product, and especially as Steve says, if you can use it for TRT, because it's got multiple S's in it, because it's got different products in it, why not just double up? So typically running, as Steve said, the equivalent of 100 milligrams, maybe a little bit more for your TRT dose, but once or twice a year, double it up, going up to 200 milligrams or 300 milligrams. And using that as a cycle, you've made no changes. You're literally just increasing the small. In fact, you can
yeah.
probably pin the same amount, but sort of amount of times per week, but slightly increase the volume of product that's being injected.
So let's go over the last one, multi-ester test 400. This is a newer one that Pharmaqo is offering, and it contains a blend of esters as well. So you guys can check that out, and it's a pretty cool blend. So again, both of these are good for those who like to run blends. You can do less injections, where you can pin once a
Yes.
week or less with higher volume. Let's talk about Pharmaqo in general. Why has it gotten so popular? Pharmaqo caters to their customers. So let me talk about this for a couple minutes, and I'll let Mobster give his thoughts before finishing up the show. And Pharmaqo is one that I like to use. They have top-notch shipping, they have amazing service, they have excellent products, and they have availability. As you can see, we talking on this show about their testosterone. They have so many testosterone options, so you can't complain that Pharmaqo doesn't have you covered if you want to use testosterone. I mean, we literally talked about how many Mobster? We talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different testosterone options that they have. So whether you want to go short ester, long ester, blends, whatever, they have you covered. The good thing about their testosterone, it's been tested and it's dosed perfect no matter what your goals are. So you don't have to worry about getting an overdose. You're not going to have to worry about getting an underdose. You're going to have to clean gear. This is why professionals and gym rats trust them for their
Yeah,
cycles and for their HRT or TRT. So it's a great brand. I highly recommend them. And if you want to learn where to find Pharmaqo, like we said, you got to come on the forum, evolutionary.org, come in the forums, ask, and you will receive. Obviously, we can't say on here and we can't post, so stop asking us on social media this stuff, guys. I
not
mean,
so not on. We can't do it on social
yeah,
media,
it's
guys.
moderated on social media, so if we
Yeah,
post anything like that, it's going to get taken down anyway. So you come on the forum and
yes,
participate, join in the
yes.
forum. It's
Yeah.
free. We would love to have you. Momster, tell us your final thoughts on Pharmaqo before we
Yeah,
finish.
look, guys, imagine that you was first new to the game, so to speak. You were new to the whole idea of using performance enhancement products. One of the things that I've talked about, Steve, and I'm just doing this on the visual aspect, you if you go to a pharmacy, chemist as we call them here in the UK, and you look at the products that are kept in those cabinets behind the pharmacy counter that the pharmacist has even been prescribed for you or the pharmacist is going to recommend for you, not the generic stuff you can buy over the counter at a gas station or your local supermarket, but the actual pharmaceutical products. They have a certain look. And the companies that produce these products produce this, make the products in that particular way because they want you to think that this has been reproduced in a certain way, sterile, tested, licensed, people that come in, inspectors from outside, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that attracts you to a lab, attracts you to a source, a company like Pharmaqo, is the visual. It's the way that they put the products together, the cleanness of the oils, the smoothness of the oils, the reputation. But let's just start with the visual. Literally looking like pharmaceutical products in the same way as literally, as I say, the cabinets behind the pharmacist's counter. Then you've got things like we talked about when you come onto the forums. What are you looking for? You're looking for users that have used the products, users that have had results. If you can find a user like you that's got the same aims as you are, and you almost certainly will, you can sometimes find a log where they've run Pharmaqo products from the sources like we talked about and see the results that that person had. We actually did a show called Model to do reference modeling, which is the idea of you doing someone like yourself, copying what they do to get similar results. So you can come onto the forum and you can check out. They can show you photographs, and quite often do, Steve, in their logs, of the products that they've purchased from an approved source, and it will include Pharmaqo products. This is what it looked like when it arrived in a post. This is what it was like. I loved how it was to inject. I started to feel the effects of this form of testosterone straight away. I'm already shagging the wife more than I normally do. These kind of things. And then what's really, really cool, Steve, and it's stuff like we touched upon already, the results. So Joe wanted to get in shape. Joe wanted a six pack for the beach. Here's Joe's abs at the end of his 8 or his 12 or his 16-week cycle. Here's the food that Joe ate. And he was using Pharmaqo products. Why the fuck wouldn't you want to use a product that's made Joe look like that? Because he's looking great. He got great results. And that's literally, this is not some sort of weird AI generated bullshit. It's literally people, you can contact Joe. You can say to, I'm just using Joe as an example, guys. You can ask Joe, what was it like to inject? Where did you get it from? Did you use an approved source? Um, how much did your bench go up? How many calories did you have to cut? And again, this is all in the logs. And one of the things that Steve's touched upon, and I really like this, and we talked about this on other shows, is real well testing. There has been in the past where companies have cherry picked their products to make sure that the product was up to scratch. Then they've tested it in house. So some years ago, and we have this regularly now, Steve, as you know, the whole lab test thing become a big fucking deal, properly big deal. People would get together to gather their bucks together when it was more expensive. It gets product tested. And as we finish the show, there's this thing where we've referred to this multiple times. A single specific user on Evolutionary from his own pocket got company products tested. These were all from approved sources, including Pharmaqo. Sent those products off, and every single product, including Pharmaqo, when it come back, was on fucking point. Within, as I said this before on other shows, less than the allowance that the pharmaceutical industry as a whole allows for. The deviation, I believe, is somewhere between 5 and 10%. And not a single product that was tested in that particular bunch of 10 different products being tested, Steve, not a single product was plus or minus 3%. They were all well within range of what they needed to be. They were all potent as they claimed to be. They were all clean. And again, guys, you can come onto the forums. You can ask us questions specifically about particular products, how you use those products, what your aim of your cycle is, and so on and so forth. We definitely encourage that, Steve, in the comments below, and definitely on the forums. Come on and check it out. Just do a search for someone who wants what you want from a cycle. See if they use a Pharmaqo, see the results for yourself, judge for yourself how successful they were, and then create your own log. Let us know about your cycle. Let us know the Pharmaqo products you're using, and we want to see the results. And not only would you be helping yourself, you'll be helping other people like you. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions are ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.